Is a simplified representation of a computer. As we see, we have the processor, we have some wires, a set of wires that we call the address bus, the data bus, and control bus to signal the different memories that we have addressed to put some data on the data bus so the processor could read them and make sense out of them. Now, when we double click on a program that is saved in the hard disk or in the floppy, what happens is that that program, which is a combination of instructions and data, would be loaded inside the RAM. Let me actually make this bit. So the processor would read those instructions by addressing the RAM, would fetch those instructions inside itself in some places called register, would decode them and would execute them. And the result would be performing some operations on the data. Like as an example, Notepad would be a program and the files would be the data. But as you see, and different things would have some combination or some relation through using different buses. They are connected to one another. Now, let's explain how, let's explain it actually in this way. You see, this is a floppy that we have in here. The floppy is put inside a floppy disk drive. The same way that you might have a hard disk which is put inside a hard disk drive, which both of them would be responsible of having a head which could read the data off of it and also turning the motor so that the floppy or the disk would just rotate. You could just test it by putting a CD and you see how it rotates and you could actually hear its voice. So you see, even without any computer, we could look at the data sheet of the hard disk drive or the floppy disk drive, and we see that it has some pins. Some of them are inputs or outputs, and we could connect to those pins and give the instructions to the floppy disk drive or hard disk drive to tell it to read the data off of the floppy or hard disk or write some data on them. But it would be really hard because you should understand the architecture of those drives and how exactly data are saved on the storage devices. Instead, something else has been created. So imagine, or as an example, if as a programmer you wanted to connect your computer directly to the floppy disk drive or the hard disk drive, it would be a bit hard because you need to understand its architecture completely and then write the instructions in the processor and tell it what to do. So instead, something else, an indirection has been uh, created, has been put in between. That's called the floppy disk controller or hard disk controller. Now, sometimes we refer to this as FDC or HDC as opposed to the hard disk drive, which is HDD, or floppy disk drive, which is FDD. So FDC or floppy disk controller has been implemented in a way that some instruction has been taught to it. Those instructions like read, write, and format, the designer of this FDC or floppy disk controller has implemented these instructions inside it so that the floppy could translate them for the floppy disk drive, or the hard disk controller would understand a set of instructions and could translate them for the hard disk drive, and the hard disk drive would carry out those operations on the hard disk. So you see, it's just like the processor. In the processor, we know that a set of instructions have been implemented or have been taught to the CPU that are called the ISR of that processor. Depending on what processor, you have some instruction that processor understands that you could look at the manual or the data sheet of that processor, and using those instructions, you would write programs. Even right now that you write programs in C or C++ or Python or other things, eventually those lines that you write would be translated to the instructions in the processor. Everything is in direction to simplify our lives. The same way, the floppy disk controller has been created, a set of instructions has been taught to the floppy disk controller that us programmers, we could use those instructions to instruct the or read or write data on the floppy and instruct the FTC to perform some operation. So it makes our life much easier, this level of indirection. Now, let me also talk about the monitor. You see, this was for the floppy or hard disk. As you see, the floppy disk controller is connected both to the data bus and the address bus. So the processor would program the floppy disk controller by choosing some memory cells or registers in the floppy disk controller and would put the